Good afternoon, everybody. It's a great pleasure to be here to honor Per Penstrup Anderson. I've known Per, I think the first time I met Per was in 1992, when I was an upstart economist out of Los Baños, Erie. And Per was just starting his job as Director General of IFPRI, I think, at that time. And met him, and at that time, he was so modest. I was a young economist, really scared of people like Director Generals, but he invited me to sit next to him and tell him what I was doing. And that started a long relationship, long mentoring and friendship. And one of the primary reasons I left my cushy job at the Gates Foundation to move to wintry Ithaca is because of the encouragement I got from Per to come and do something real after signing checks for a while. And so I took up that challenge. And I came here, and I've actually been teaching his food policy course. And that's been a lot of fun, just trying to put together a lot of development practice into a course has been huge fun. And after all these years of having Per as a mentor and a friend, I finally got him as a boss. He is the chairman of the advisory committee of the Tata Cornell Agriculture Nutrition Program. And so, in a sense, I have to make sure I'm on his good side to get some positive reports from the advisory board once a while. Good. So this paper that we're going to talk about is a paper that Katie Ricketts, David San, and I put together. An earlier version of this paper was presented a few weeks ago in Rome by David, and Katie was there also, at the ICN2 Technical Working Group meeting. And David can talk a lot more about the reception there. But the idea behind this paper is essentially to bring three different streams of thought together. So economists, development economists generally talk about structural transformation of economies, the movement of economies from primarily rural-based societies to increasingly urbanized, industrialized societies, and that the change in resource balance, etc., in that regard. Peter Timmer and others have spent a lot of time working about this. The nutrition community has been spending a lot of time talking about the primary problems of undernutrition, micronutrient malnutrition, but also this nutrition transition that's taking place towards obesity, etc., overweight, obesity, and all of that. And the agricultural community, the agriculture policy community, has been trying to make its own transition from its predominant focus on staple crop productivity growth, promoting staple crops in its post-Green Revolution period, to looking more broadly at food and diets and diversification of diets, etc. So what this paper is trying to do is to try and bring all these three sets of thought and these three communities together. So first, what are the big nutritional challenges that we're talking about? We've been talking about this all day, and we'll continue talking about this for the rest of today and tomorrow. But essentially, we're talking about some of the traditional problems around nutrition: persistence of underweight births, persistent childhood stunting, etc., the inequality in access to food, and then the more emerging issues around obesity, around food safety issues, etc. So these are all major problems, each one of them an important problem in its own right, each one of them having significant amount of attention being given to it. But the point that I would like to make today is that the nature and the magnitude of these nutritional challenges varies quite significantly by the stage of economic development you're in, by the stage of the structural transformation process that a country is in. And I think that's the fundamental point that I'd like to bring out here, because once we know what the nutritional challenge is by the stage of structural transformation, it's much easier to target agriculture policies to address that problem. So first, what is structural transformation? There are a lot of people who've talked about structural transformation, written a lot about it. One of the people who's been particularly prolific in this area is Peter Timmer. And those of you who are more interested in pursuing this discussion should look at some of his work in this area. Now, Peter, when he talked about structural transformation, essentially thought about it in terms of four interrelated processes. First, as an economy grows, you see a declining share of agriculture in GDP. And second, you see a movement of labor from rural to urban areas, and that then triggers the overall process of urbanization that takes place. Third is the movement from predominantly rural societies to a modern industrial service sector, and that transition away from an agriculture-based economies to modern industrial economies. And fourth, the demographic transition to having populations that are healthier, having lower mortality rates, especially for children, etc. And these were the four broad processes that Peter Timmer and that group of development economists have talked about for a long time. And the idea that's driven very heavily in the discussion is all of these processes start with agriculture growing. Agriculture productivity growth pushes the overall process of structural transformation. So agriculture acts as an engine of overall economic growth. So now more recently, myself and some other people have been trying to bring the nutrition transition into the realm of the structural transformation discussion, to say that as you go through this process of moving from rural societies to more urbanized, industrialized societies, you will by necessity also see a nutrition transition taking place, because as incomes rise, the demand for more diverse diets, higher quality diets, etc., also rises. But at the same time, as populations are becoming more urbanized, and more of the labor force includes women in the labor force, and women move away from household activities to urban professional activities, opportunity cost of time changes, the demand for more convenient food, processed food, etc., increases. And so this nutritional transition leads to this movement away from a focus on primary staple foods towards more diversity of diets, but also more consumption of processed foods. So that's the overall transition that we are talking about. So when you think about the process of structural transformation, this is a historical process that's been repeated country after country after country. There's a really good paper that Peter Timmer put together a few years ago, which brought the analytics around this very, very clearly, showing across about 100 countries the way the process works. And it shows the dots in blue show you the share of agriculture in GDP, and the red shows you the share of agriculture in the overall labor force. Now, it turns out that the share of agriculture in GDP falls much faster than the share of population moving out of rural areas. And so it turns out that there is a certain stickiness of populations continuing to stay in rural areas long after that process of transformation has been kicking in from a GDP point of view. So what that means is that you begin to see poverty continuing to be concentrated in rural areas. You begin to see malnutrition and undernutrition continuing to be concentrated in rural areas. And hence, if you don't focus on addressing those problems in rural environments, you run into the problem of continuing to see that stickiness of poor populations concentrated in rural environments and populations not being able to grow themselves out of poverty. So that's one of the big lessons that come out of looking at this structural transformation discussion. A few years ago, I put together a piece where we tried to tease some of that out, and we put the structural transformation process along with the UNDP's Human Development Index. And those of you who may not know, the Human Development Index actually is a composite index which looks at the health, educational status, and income status of countries and brings them together. So nutrition comes there into that indirectly in terms of child mortality rates and the decline or not thereof of child mortality rates. So if you look at that, and the red indicates countries that are very low in terms of the Human Development Index, whereas the blue indicates countries that are very high on the Human Development Index. And you'll notice that much of the countries which are at the lower end of the structural transformation process are also countries that are ranked very low in terms of Human Development Index because of poor health issues, low levels of educational attainments, and low income levels. All of these coming together. And so that's quite striking to see that the transition from low to high human development also follows that same pattern. And what we then did was to say, what does agriculture and food systems look like along this process of transition? And so we then cut up this whole structural transformation process into 3 sets of countries. Countries with low productive agriculture, countries with more modernizing agriculture systems, these are sort of the post-Green Revolution type countries, and countries with more commercialized agriculture, where you move into a process of agriculture being a business like any other business, rather than agriculture being a way of life. And it's quite striking how all of these sort of match together. And that's something where it immediately brings a connection between the process of structural transformation, the nutrition transition, and agriculture policy, and the way agriculture policy needs to relate to all of this. Now, what does structural transformation process have to do with nutrition? Patrick Webb did a really great piece, Patrick Webb and Steve Block, which came out in the PNAS. And their work shows very clearly that as you go through this process of structural transformation, you do see a decline, a fairly dramatic decline in stunting taking place, and a decline in wasting taking place. But also, as you go through the process of structural transformation, you see the obesity incidences rising. And that's very clear, and it's quite striking how the nutrition transition now comes very clearly into the same discussion of the structural transformation process. So what does agriculture have to do with all of this? Why should we even care about agriculture in this process? Well, the same paper from Patrick Webb separates out countries that have had very strong support for their agriculture sector. And here we're talking about countries that are at the very low end of the structural transformation process, relative to countries that have not had the same level of support for the agriculture sector. And when you look at those sets of countries, you can see the gains that have been made in the reduction of stunting have been very closely associated with countries that have had a very strong focus on their agriculture sectors in the early stage of the development process. And this can happen for many reasons. One of the reasons it can happen is because agriculture acts as an engine of overall economic growth, which then drives a whole set of changes. But it can also happen because investments in agriculture improve overall food supplies, food prices decline, there's increased diversity, improved access to food, et cetera, et cetera. So all of these factors can come together and work together as we think about it. So as we move forward, and as we think about economies that are at the low end of the structural transformation process, and we think about how do we address these economies with an agriculture lens in trying to look at the nutrition issues, then we come back and say, well, much of the nutrition community now has coalesced around the first 1,000 days as the main window of opportunity for reducing stunting. And we heard about that this morning. And that's the window of opportunity that the agriculture community would also need to work in if we want to make an impact on stunting. So once you say that, once you say, okay, it's the first 1,000 days, then the question comes up, then what does agriculture have to do with the first 1,000 days? I think the response to that is, if you're interested in the first 1,000 days of a child, then your target population is actually adolescent girls and women of childbearing age. It's the women who are between 15 to 45 years of age. And the health of that population is crucial if you want to have the first 1,000 days to be successful. And given that much of this population is living in rural areas, given that much of them are agricultural households, addressing the problems of agriculture, both in terms of food supply for this population of women, but also making sure that this population of women's labor in agriculture is reduced significantly so that they can, I went off into something, so that they can then have a healthy birth and have a healthy post-birth period, postnatal period, etc., is really, really crucial. So that's where agriculture comes into the story when we look forward at that. So the way we conceptualize the role of agriculture and nutrition, we certainly see agriculture and nutrition as being part of a multidimensional set of issues that need to be addressed if we want to make change and sustainable change. Part of that is related to household access to food, and the other part is related to individual access to nutrition and individual ability to absorb those nutrients. And it's related to certainly income, the ability of rural households to expand their income, improve their overall agriculture productivity, etc., but also in terms of the availability of micronutrient-rich food. And this can come through improved access to vegetables, horticulture products, livestock products, etc., but things like biofortification and fortification program, food-based safety net programs, all of these play a major role in this. And then at the same time, one needs to look at intra-household issues. Intra-household issues around allocation of food within the household, allocation of food for women and girls relative to men and boys, how pregnant women are treated, food and other health aspects around pregnancy, etc. And finally, as we talked about this morning, the whole issue around sanitation, clean drinking water, etc. So all of these factors come together. And so when you think about agriculture policy, we need to think about agriculture policy in the context of the multidimensionality of the nutrition problem. And I go through, and we will eventually in this paper spell these out much more clearly, but talk about the role agriculture policy plays, both in terms of improving overall rural household incomes and acting as an engine of growth, and also, 0 minutes, and also in terms of the micronutrient access and availability. Similarly, a whole set of complementary policies that need to come into place for addressing the issues of intra-household allocation of food and also the the water and sanitation issues. So one of the things that we try to do here, I know it's 0 minutes, but if I can beg for 2 minutes, one of the things we try to do here is to separate out the countries in terms of the stage of the structural transformation process they're in terms of whether they're low productive agriculture systems, modernizing systems, and commercializing systems, and look at what specific policy interventions need to take place at each level. So if you think about the low productive agriculture systems, agriculture still plays a major role as an engine of growth. Agriculture still plays a major role in terms of overall food supply improvement, because income elasticity of demand for staples continues to be positive. So as incomes rise, people will continue to eat staple food. So that continues to be an intervention that's important, but what we can learn from the Green Revolution experience is to look at opportunities for promoting alternatives to the traditional staples that we have. So looking at opportunities for millets and higher protein, higher nutrient staple grains, etc., biofortification programs, etc., that can play a major role in bringing about a nutrition balance. At the same time, looking at backyard vegetable production, poultry production, etc., could be part of that strategy, along with biofortification, which could play a really important role. At the same time, looking at food safety issues, mycotoxins and the implications of mycotoxins on nutrition and how do you address that. So these are some of the areas one can see coming together. I don't have time, but we've gone through this sort of analysis for modernizing agriculture systems, and finally, a similar analysis around commercializing agriculture systems. As you get to the more commercialized agriculture systems, the issues around food safety becomes really important as you go to more industrialized production systems, etc. And so issues around One Health, etc., become major areas of concern, and agriculture policy can come in a big way in helping address some of those emerging concerns. Let me go to my last slide here. Finally, I think as agriculturalists, we also need to figure out what are the complementary policies that need to be put in place. So there's significant amount of complementary policies around behavior change that need to take place, significant complementary policies around clean drinking water, sanitation, all of those issues that need to come in, and figuring out more holistically across all these sectors as to what's important and how do we bring these together, especially for countries that are at the lowest end of the structural transformation process, is absolutely crucial. So with that, thank you very much. Sorry it took longer than I expected.